Alrighty, Discord Q&A number 7 coming right up. We got lots of questions loaded into the doc. Certainly not getting through all of these in 1 hour, but we'll see how far we get. One thing I did want to mention before I get onto the questions for today's doc was a follow-up to a question from number 6, where I was talking about combat structure and how MOBAs traditionally don't have like a dedicated healer class because of combat, because of the way that combat is structured and how that combat structure is important for the game to be able to end. I had a lot of people messaging me like, "Oh, you've never played HOTS. The HOTS has a dedicated healer class," or what about HOTS, or you should play HOTS. The answer here is I've actually played HOTS for several hundred hours. I think certainly way less than 1,000, but probably I'd guess around 200-ish hours. Probably that's a really rough estimate. Could be less, could be more. I'm not really sure. This is a long time ago. The reason why I wasn't really considering HOTS when I was talking about that is that HOTS doesn't really have the same structure for the game ending, right? The HOTS has a bunch of different maps that all have their own unique mechanics for ending the game, where they tried to leverage maps as a key game-to-game variance element of the game will end very differently, and this will allow their heroes to have different different types of powers and such different levels of power on different maps, which they thought was really interesting and compelling. HOTS is a whole interesting topic. I would love to talk about it some other time. I'm not going to talk about it here, but the reason why HOTS I don't think is really a relevant example here when I'm talking about combat structure in MOBAs is that HOTS doesn't end games in the same way that other MOBAs do, where they're much less bound to player action directly ending the game, right? They're much more okay with indirect actions being, the course of the ending the game, right? There's maps where you don't even hit an enemy base, that you have to like fire cannons at the enemy base from the other side of the map, and the defenders actually don't have an advantage in the same way that they do in basically every other traditional MOBA structure, right? As another example, like Brawl Stars, which is sort of MOBA-like, also has a dedicated healer class because their combat structure is completely different than a traditional MOBA, right? You have to be more of a traditional MOBA. You got to think of games like Dota 2, League, MLBB, COG, Wild Rift, right? What's another great one? I don't know, like Paragon, back when that existed, Han, right? Like these games all have the traditional base structure, and so because of that, none of these games have a dedicated healer class that's allowed to permanently top people off outside of combat, because while maybe you could power budget, 1 or 2 characters to do that, it's something that's very, very difficult to make your combat structure make sense with, where a lot of the things about in your game start making less sense when the baseline expectation in the game is that chip damage doesn't matter, right? Like it's actually important for attrition to matter, because otherwise, the fact that defenders have an advantage when they're in their base because they have access to their fountain or well or whatever the equivalent is in your game starts to disappear, right? And I don't want to get too in depth on this, right? This is a question from a previous Q&A, but basically to sum it up, number 1, I have played HOTS. Number 2, I don't really consider it to be an example of having the same combat structure as other sort of classic or traditional MOBAs, because it just uses map-to-map variance and structures their game ending conditions in a very different way than other MOBAs. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about before I got into this. So let's move on to the questions, talking about why do champions not get XP per minute passively like gold? This is interesting because we actually do have this in Wild Rift. This is one of the things that when I was back on the game analysis team and we were making Wild Rift, it's something that I actually did a bunch of math on of like how much power actually is this per second. The answer is when you bring up the baseline on anything, what you're doing is essentially saying it matters less what you like how you optimize this resource, right? Because if you give everyone X amount per minute or X amount per second, X amount per time, essentially what that means is that what you do isn't as important in regards to this resource, right? Your actions are less important, right? Because if you think about it, let's suppose that depending on what your actions are, you can gain anywhere from 0 to 100 experience per minute, right? And then I say, okay, next patch, I'm going to add 10 experience per minute to everyone, no matter what, right? And so this means that, okay, let's actually use a more extreme example because I think it's easier to illustrate the point. Let's suppose I say, I'm going to give you 100 experience per minute, no matter what. Well, that means that now, instead of being, theoretically infinite X, the experience per minute, if you're maximizing it, you're 100 comparatively to someone who's 0. The only thing you can do, the best you can do, is double, right? You can get 200 comparatively to 100 experience per minute. So obviously that's an extreme example. That's not what people are suggesting, right? But using it to illustrate the point of what you're doing is essentially saying, your actions in regard to this space are less important because everyone is getting this guaranteed. And we've done things like, manipulated this in some ways in regards to gold, right? As an example, if you go back to season 2, gold per minute used to be a lot lower and gold per minion used to be a lot higher, right? And so farming was relatively more important. And of course, if you were someone who wasn't farming, you were just insanely poor. Everyone who played back then will remember being a ward bot because you had no gold. And one of the reasons for that is that we have dedicated support items that give you gold or gold per 10 on them or both. I guess both. The current one gives both. But also part of the reason is that the global gold is higher, right? And so we've actually made it so that being zoned off of a wave is slightly less painful by giving you gold. Okay, so how does this relate to experience per minute? Why not do it, or why do it, or why not do it? Largely what we've found is that we want experience to be a differentiator and something that is a reward for staying in lane. The longer and longer the game has gone on, what we've found is that there are a lot of optimizations for roaming around that are very, very, very powerful. And we've found it harder and harder to tune these over the years, where people have just gotten a lot better at roaming. People haven't gotten relatively nearly as much better at laning than they have at roaming. And so we need additional ways to incentivize people to lane, right? As an example, role quests are a part of this, right? Where we say, hey, by the way, if you stay in your lane, you get better role quest progress, right? Because roaming is really effective, especially for supports, but even for some of the other roles, right? Like we had to do, within the last few years, we've had to do changes to make it so that roaming from mid lane was less powerful, right? If you remember the mid lane wave state changes, where the mid lane waves don't, or they sync up with the side waves in such a way that roaming without losing minions today is harder than it was back in like 2021, for example. And so basically what's happened over the years is that through both systemic change and also I think players getting better at the game, roaming and not laning have gotten more and more optimal. And so I don't think ever really considered saying we want experience per minute, because largely what XP per minute does is says you don't need to stay in your lane as much. It's not to say that there's no structure for League that could ever have XP per minute, but I think we largely find it to like the current structure to kind of work. And we don't really want the core thing that would, giving XP per minute would do, which is make laning and staying in lane less important. We don't really want that in the current game. We could come to a future version of the game where we actually do want that, and maybe then we would consider something like XP per minute. But largely, we just find it to be that we overall want to encourage people to, farm minions and stay in their lane, and that's positive. And so we generally don't find ourselves in a position where we're looking at this mechanic and saying, oh my God, this would be so great for us if we had it. I don't think there's ever been a case where I've been working on systems design and I've said something like, damn, I really wish we had XP per minute so that I could tune it in regard to this system. That could happen in the future, right? I don't make any promises about that. Things change all the time. But the reason why we don't have it is generally that we haven't really ever wanted or needed this, and we want laning and staying in lane to be important. By the way, also something I'll note, I'm sure some people will be wondering about this, is like, well, what if you just then also increase the amount of experience per level, and increase or increased experience off of minions as well? It's like that doesn't really work, right? Like you're giving everyone a baseline value of experience, which therefore must mean that not laning is relatively buffed, right? You can't give everyone more experience, like passive experience, and then also simultaneously say that experience in lanes is now more important, right? It has to be relatively less important. Even in a world where you say like make leveling take longer and give more experience on the minions themselves, then you're just saying like people level slower overall, but they still get some of that progress while they're out of lane. Anyway, okay, so this is another interesting question, I think, is why is there no easy to build generic AD crit item? I think there's a couple of different answers to this question. The first one, which is maybe in some ways the most accurate, is I think this item already exists. It's called Collector, right? I think people look at it and they say, oh, lethality, that's an assassin stat. But lethality is just a physical damage multiplier for all of your physical damage. You know what critical strike chance is? It's a physical damage multiplier for your attacks. And in the case of some champions, it also multiplies another type of damage, right? Corki, as an example, his passive crits. And so therefore, crit is a multiplier for true damage as well, right? But for the most part, for most champions, crit says your physical damage auto attacks deal more damage on average. Lethality says your physical damage deals more damage by a percent. And yes, it's early game skewed, right? But to me, the easy to build generic AD crit item is Collector. And whether you want it to be that or not, right? Like maybe it doesn't read well enough as that. That really is what it is ultimately, right? Because all it's offering you on top of the stat line, the typical AD crit stat line is your physical damage deals more damage, right? It's a physical damage multiplier, which is very similar to what crit does. Now, there's another sort of line of reasoning here, or another sort of line of logic that you can follow here, which is separate to that, which is AD carries are the most multiplicative class in the game, right? They have the most powerful later item buys, not because the individual items are the best, but because they have access to the largest number of multipliers, right? AD, AS, crit multiplier, right? They have more multipliers than any other class. They also have percent pen, right? These are all extremely powerful multipliers they have access to. Mages, as an example, have AP, haste, percent AP, and then percent pen, right? They're missing that fifth multiplier, crit, right? Which is essentially AD death cap for your auto attacks, right? If you really think about the math. And because of that, that is what puts a lot of stress on the AD carry first item. This is where we get into problems where it's like, well, if we give you a first item that gives you everything that you want in terms of like scaling all of the things that you want, AD, AS, crit, there has to be some kind of trade-off, right? There has to be something, because you are the most multiplicative class. You scale the best. Your later items, no matter what they are, as long as they're within your class item set, and they're giving you crit and so on and so forth, they're going to be more powerful than other classes. So where does that power come from, right? Does it come from your champion base stats? Does it come from your spell rank ups? I mean, on some champions a little bit, right? But ultimately, we mostly take that power budget in the item system from the first item. And so the way that we do this, we give you satisfying first purchases, or at least the way that's intended to be structured, is if you're getting that perfect first item, we give you a harsher build path, right? We say it's difficult to do this. It's harder to do this. You pay a higher cost to go this item in terms of your early lane and like around your back timings and such. And because of that, we can give you that satisfying first item that has those multipliers on it that still lets you get your powerful multipliers in your later slots. But you don't get to have everything at the same time, right? That's ultimately the answer here. Now, I will say, I think there are alternate constructions of the AD carry system where they maybe scale a little bit less well. But and then there's a trade-off there. But you can have more satisfying first items, right? That's more like the Mythic system, for example, where in the Mythic system, right, crit was 20% on every item, and you only got 175% crit, and so it was easier to give AD carries a very, very powerful first item, like a Kraken Slayer or a Gale Force, and that structure, it's functional, right? I think there are meaningful trade-offs, but the current system structure that we have says you are the most multiplicative class by a lot, right? And because of that, there have to be trade-offs somewhere. We've chosen to put those trade-offs largely on the first slot. There are other places we could put them, right? As an example, we could make the first items better and make every AD carry even weaker, right? Another round of nerfs to every single AD carry, as an example. Would that be better or more satisfying? I don't know, right? It's something that I think ultimately is the actual true answer to this question is because of the way that the AD carry item system is currently structured. It doesn't have to be that way, but I think it's like the way it's currently structured makes a lot of sense. You either opt into something that's not a perfect first item, or you have a hard build path. You're the class that scales the best with items, so those seem like reasonable trade-offs to me. But if you disagree, let me know. I think there are other ways the system could be structured. I even experimented with some of them for this season. We did not end up shipping any of them, of course, but I think that it's an interesting space to think about for sure. And I wouldn't be surprised if we wanted to do more tests in that area at some point, because it is interesting looking at that structure. All right. So now we're moving on. 2. Are items the best way to further champion fantasies? What about more champ-specific systems? Call back to earlier when I was talking about HOTS. HOTS has a really good example of this. Their talent system, where if you're not familiar with it, every hero in HOTS at certain level breakpoints, I think it's like 1 5, I don't remember the level, but basically you start with 1 at level 1, and then at a certain level you unlock a new talent. You choose between 3, and they're hero specific in HOTS, right? um Dota has a lighter version of a similar system. It's lighter, of course. Dota 2 has items, which makes sense. Other MOBAs have there are some other MOBAs that have similar things like this, where they use very, very hero slash champion specific systems that are custom designed for each individual character in the game. One barrier to this in League is that League just has an enormous number of characters, right? At least as far as MOBAs that I've played, I think League has the most individual characters. There might be other ones with more, but if there are, I don't know about them. We have over 170 champs in the game now. That's a lot. And you can kind of you can kind of see why we haven't made one of these systems in the past, despite myself. I am a huge fan of this, right? I would, for the past like 8 years, every single time we have a meeting for what are we going to do for next season, the pitch meeting, I always show up and I pitch Ags every single time because I think it's such a cool concept. But the reason why we don't do this in terms of time efficiency is, think about it this way. Let's suppose, right? I'm not saying this is true. Let's suppose, like, take a look at something like a keystone rune. Let's say it takes me a month to make a keystone rune as a designer, and it has some amount of art cost or whatever, right? Okay, right. That's fine. That cost essentially gets distributed, or sort of like the value of that gets multiplied by not exactly 170 plus, because obviously not every champion is going to take every keystone, but by some amount, right? Maybe I make a new keystone and it's used by 10 champions. And so we're getting the value of like sort of more than 10 champs, because other people will think about it and look at it, and they can at least try it. And maybe it's valuable experience to have to try it out on that champ, right? But we're getting more than 1x the value of the time that I put in, right, as a game designer on making a generic system, right? If you think about specific systems, it's a lot easier to make them, right? Like, maybe it only takes me 1 or 2 weeks to make a keystone rune equivalent for a specific champion, but at the end of the day, we only get the value out of that one champion using it. And so from a pure time efficiency perspective, uh, it is hard to justify doing highly specialized champion content unless your pitch involves saying, hey, I'm going to create something that is so immensely valuable that you actually, on a per champion basis, that you actually can't make it with a generic system, right? Because of course you can make things that are incredibly cool with champion or character specific effects, right? As an example, we can't make something that says your Lucian Q, when it hits an enemy, shoots 2 more Lucian Qs or 3 Lucian Qs and a cone behind them, right? It's like, that doesn't really make sense in a generic world, right? What are we going to say when your skill shot hits an enemy, it splits into 3? Like, maybe that would function in some games, but there's a lot of weird skill shots in League that's just not going to work with, or not going to make sense with, right? Um, so, not even saying that's a particularly cool example. I don't even think that's that cool. I don't even know why that's an example that I came up with. I guess like Vel'Koz Q would be a better example. Like, your Vel'Koz Q splits into, in a circle or something like that, instead of splitting into 2 when it hits a target. I don't know, whatever, right? Something cool like that. Obviously, the coolness factor of things that you can make in that space is much higher. Like, the ceiling is higher. But we haven't had a situation where someone has pitched, hey, let's make a system that has a really incredibly high coolness ceiling, and we have like this crazy amount of time that we would need to make it for all 170 plus champions that are in League, right? It's something, again, I'm a huge supporter of it. I think these kinds of things, the ceiling is high and they can be insanely cool. But when you think about time efficiency of like the value of one designer's time, or like an X number of designer time doing game design, generic systems generally are going to be better value per time, because you get to multiply the value of your effort spent on a system by that thing being usable by multiple different champions. And so that's why these systems don't exist in the current game. And that's why, as an example, to extrapolate this, a lot of the time people ask for champion-specific augments in Arena and ARAM Mayhem. The reason why there are only a very, very, very small handful of these, I believe, I think there's like is there a Draven Darius one? I think there's like a Blood Brothers one, I believe. I don't know if there's any others actually off the top of my head. And oh no, there's a Yunara one as well. So the reason why there's so few of these is, again, think about the time efficiency of someone spending time making augments. You can make an augment that can be seen by one player, one out of every 172 times this, the champion is played or whatever, right? So that might mean that it's seen, 1% or less the amount of times that a normal augment would be seen. Actually, probably less, right? But depends on the pick rate of that champion and other external factors and so on and so forth. But uh, a generic augment, even if it's even if it's half as exciting, is just often going to be better time value. That's why, right? Like that's why we haven't really spent a lot of time making these things. But of course, we have made some, right? Like the Yunara augment was something that Yellow hooked up when he was making Yunara, and I remember he was very excited. I remember he kept coming to my desk and telling me about his awesome, Yunara specific augment and how he was gonna make Yunara build these, ridiculous items in order to unlock the augment and all of that. And I think that's really fun for some people. And there is, like again, like I said, a higher ceiling for the value of uh, these types of effects for especially some types of player. But honestly, even just like the general player, I think can get more value out of a tailored specific thing that is made for your character. And so I think there is potential for these kinds of things in the future. It's just we haven't had that pitch yet, or haven't had that thing done yet. All right. So we have a lot of enchanters with attack synergy. What are your thoughts about an enchanter who specifically buffs abilities or mages? This is something we've played around with a number of times internally. We've had champions that messed with allied cooldowns, for example. We've had champions that mess with like allied spells. Milio was largely developed while I was still working on Wild Rift, but as an example, I think there was a version of Milio where the passive that like burns enemies was spell hit only. I think not 100% sure about that because that's just I wasn't in playtest. That was just me reading my emails from when I was working on Wild Rift. Uh, but the summary of this is like I think it could be cool. The tough part is that when we make an enchanter, the enchanter players aren't really looking to bind themselves to specific allies. That's why there's not like an enormous amount of power associated with, say, the AD on Janna's shield. Like there's not a huge amount of Janna's power budget or the attack speed on Lulu's W as examples. Um, it's real power, right? Don't get me wrong. And it does make them synergize better with AD carries than other champions. But it's not the case where it's like the whole champion is about this. And so if we were to ever do something like this, I suspect it would be a mild synergy where, oh, this champion is good with mages or like good with casters, and that would make them good with, say, like the Smolders and the Lucians of the world, and also good with mages. I think is a totally reasonable space for an enchanter because while Janna AD is factually good with those champions, I could see something in the like ability or cooldown space being a pretty compelling, uh, mild bonus effect, right? Like, let's suppose we make a kit that's similar to Janna. For whatever reason, we want to make Janna 2. We make Janna a similar kit to Janna, disengage button, like lane harassment slash like, fighting button, disengage spell for the R, and then they have like a generic enchanter shield on their E. Imagine the buff says like, while the buff holds, your cooldowns tick 15% faster or something like that. Or I don't know what the right number would be, but something like that. I think that could be pretty cool because that's still something that a I don't know, like a Kog'Maw can appreciate, even though he's really an auto attacker. But would obviously be really awesome for a Smolder or a Lucian. And so, yeah, I think something in this space could be pretty cool. As long as the effect is not too heavy-handed. Where I suspect we'd run into issues is if we put too much of their power budget into mage or caster synergy, and they start to feel bad when played with regular AD carries. I suspect that's where we run into problems like what with the original Senna shape had, where Senna was not very good when played with other AD carries, and that made people that wanted to play Senna just like as a normal support very sad, right? When Senna is up like very heavily, like very skewed towards like melee, laning with melee champions, it becomes very difficult for us to actually make those players happy, like make the people who want to play that champion happy while maintaining the champion being balanced. And so that's why I'm always a little dubious of pitches with enchanters that go too hard on them synergizing with really any specific class, because the people that play enchanters, I think, largely aren't looking for that kind of narrower experience. And I could be wrong about that, right? This is something where, maybe August would be a better person to ask a question like this. But that's my perspective on it as a systems designer, is that I am totally on board with an enchanter that has mild ability synergy, but going too far on that, I think, is likely to result in a champion that is unsatisfying when balanced, for the people that are likely to want to play an enchanter. All right, moving on to this question about protoplasm. So this is, if you're looking at this, it's talking about future tense, but this has actually already happened because this question was asked, before the patch. So if that's confusing, sorry, I don't get to the questions super fast, so apologies. So why is protoplasm getting changes to be more of a first/second item for supports when their options are already through the roof, and resist tanks get shoved backwards away from the items supposed to be built for them? So a couple of things. Number one, I want to establish support options are not through the roof. Support tanks have the fewest items in the entire game as far as subclasses go, because they don't really have access to true income tank items, because they're too poor, right? They just don't get enough gold to buy items like Kayn, right, or Jackshow, or even Thornmail, right? Like, some people do those things, but they're pretty bad because they just don't have enough gold to make them to buy them on time. So this is the subclass that actually has the lowest number of items in the game. So that's just something I want to establish, right? Like, I've always been a huge supporter of let's make more items for them. And so I generally am a supporter of making more, functional items for them. But that's not actually that important to answering this question, I don't think. So the answer here is, if you've heard me talk about protoplasm, I said it's item for resist stacking tanks, and it's supposed to be good when you're stacking resistances. There is, however, a difference between this item is good for resistance stackers and this item is only good, or this part of the item is only good on very, very highly over-indexed resistance stackers like Rammus, right? Basically, the answer here was that this item was actually tuned in such a way, I had tuned the ratios so high that we couldn't make the item good, good for a broader audience, because Rammus was limiting how powerful the item could be because of this mechanic. And so I am the one who did these changes. I trimmed some power from the resistance scaling in order to put that power elsewhere. If that means it's no longer a resistance scaling item and it's only for tank supports, I would, make further changes to the item. But my perception was that I think I overly resist skewed it. In the same way that, like, good comparison here would be Infinity Edge is the crit damage scaling item. But imagine a world where Infinity Edge has 10 AD and then it has like 120% crit damage. That version of the item is going to be a lot better on champions with, say, an AD steroid like Vayne or Twitch than it is on just like regular crit champions like Jinx, right? Because Jinx doesn't have an AD steroid, right? And so there are like, it is possible for an item to scale with something too well, and it ends up being limited by its own intended audience, right? And what I mean by this is that not all of the intended audience is going to be equal, right? There are differences in how good resistance scaling is amongst our tanks, and so I want the item to still have resistance scaling on it. I just thought it was too extreme at 250%, right? This is just, yeah, my bad. I put a really crazy number on it because it seemed like that was what we needed in development. After seeing the item on live for a few patches, it seems like I was just wrong. It seems like I put that number too high. And so I scaled it back a bit, right? But it still has really powerful resistance scaling, right? 175% of both resistances is still a pretty high number. So it's possible I've mistuned it. We'll see how this shakes out, right? Patch hasn't been out for too long. I'll be keeping an eye on it 100%. Yeah, we'll see how it plays out. But this kind of sums up my perspective on it, is that it'll still scale well with resistances, just not to the point where we can't buff the item because of Rammus. All right. Would restriction R solves the problem of mages having crit on abilities? So if you've heard me talk about this, or if you've heard August talk about it, I think we say pretty much exactly the same thing about this. Ability crit is something that we just don't think we can do in League, because attack crit, at least, attacks are something that gets rolled around every second or more frequently most of the time you're interacting with someone. And so the amount of maximum variance you can have on like attack crit isn't that high, right? You get into a fight with to the death with someone who has 25% crit. Sure, maybe they get lucky and they crit you twice in 4 autos or something like that, and you die because of that because you started the fight at 75% health or whatever. And that can suck, right? Like that can feel bad. But the frequency of autos is very high. Like on the whole, right? Comparatively to spells. The problem with spells is that spells on average are just too infrequent. And yes, restricting the ultimates away from this would improve that, but it doesn't get anywhere close to solving the problem, right? That's my perspective on this, is that even something like an 8-second cooldown spell, which is a relatively like lower end cooldown for a spell, it's too high of a cooldown. It's too low of a cadence for crit to be an acceptable gameplay experience, right? Imagine this as an example. You're playing against a Lux, and Lux E crits you and kills you. Because it does, twice as much damage, or 150% damage or whatever. That is not really a reasonable gameplay experience. That spell doesn't like the spell doesn't get rolled often enough. You can kind of think of it as like, how many of these things does it take to kill someone? With auto attacks, especially when you're at lower amounts of crit, that number is pretty high, right? Even in the extreme cases of like Draven Axes, it's still going to be like 6 auto attacks a lot of the time, right? With spells, it can often be 4 or even 3 in some more extreme cases, when you're talking about spells like Vagar W, right? And so ultimately, the answer to this is no. I do not think that not letting ultimates crit would allow mages to have spell crit. I just think that spells are too low frequency, and the variance of having crit on them is too poor of a gameplay experience, where an interaction is too highly variant. A mage blows all their cooldowns, they either crit or they don't, right? If they have spell crit, I don't think that experience is good enough in a world where spells are allowed to crit, for us to do that, regardless of whether their ultimates can crit or not. All right, why Tunneler and not Jaurim's Fist? This is, for those of you not familiar, Jaurim's Fist is an old AD/HP epic that we had in the game. It used to be a stacking epic, actually, where you would stack HP. There are a few reasons for this. This is a question that if you ever catch Flox streaming, he was the one who decided to go with a different item over Jaurim's Fist, so you can ask him more about it, because he's the one who did this. He's the one who added Tunneler to the game. But ultimately, the answer was that Jaurim's Fist was largely a really unsatisfying epic when we had it in the game. And I think the perspective at the time was, why would we want to re-add a legacy item that, if people remember it, which many people don't, their memories are largely like negative of it, over just making something newer that we think could be themed in a cooler and more interesting way? Not really anything too complicated about this question. It's just, the answer is, yeah, we believe that most people had negative perception of Jaurim's Fist, and to be honest, I think that's right. Like, Jaurim's Fist was just factually pretty weak for most of the time it was in the game. It was just kind of an intentionally undertuned epic, and it could never match up to Phage in terms of like AD health epic items at that time. And so I think, even though, sure, some people, like, there's always some people that like, having callbacks to old League of Legends things in the game, we decided it was just better value to try something new that wouldn't have any negative connotations associated with it, of people remembering and being like, oh yeah, that thing that used to be in the game and it sucked. Yeah, not much else to it. This one's not too complicated of a question. All right. Why don't turrets change color or something to indicate damage ramping? So this is an interesting one. This is we've spun up a few projects that touched on this a few times, but we've never actually shipped any of them, except the one where, if you don't know about this, the turret shots actually do get larger as the turret gets more ramped, but it's pretty subtle. There's a couple of things going on here. Number one is that, and disclaimer here, I am not a UX designer, so I might be misunderstanding or misrepresenting here. I want to be clear about that. But my understanding is that UX designers believe that turret heat is not relevant enough, frequently enough, to be worth a highly visible mechanic, right? They don't want to, for example, like, change the entire color of the turret or put like an overlay or a mesh on it or something like that, right? One of the projects that actually we spun up before to look at this as was a turret resource bar, which I think actually at the time I believe everyone involved was on board with this, including UX design, um, believed that this was going to be good. And what we found was actually that the way that the turret health bars are made, they can't have a resource bar unless we remake the whole thing. And so we didn't have enough time to do that in that project. And so it got spun down and turned into the project that would become the turret shots get larger as the heat ramps up. But this is something I'm not an expert. I wasn't involved in the project. This is just me as an outside observer. So I'm not 100% sure about that. But basically it's we've spun up some projects to look into this. We do think it would be better for turret damage ramping to be more visible, but we want to be careful in this space about how much mindshare or how much attention we are asking of players about turret ramping, because it's something that for most players is only going to come up every couple of games, right? Like it's only going to be relevant every few games. It's not relevant every single game, right? Imagine as an example, you're just like playing some random jungler, right? How often do you actually dive someone? How often is it actually relevant that the turret is ramped? That's like in a way that's like not super learnable. Like, hey, the turret hit me and it did more damage. You can see that a lot of the time, and that's sort of learnable in game. Again, not saying we shouldn't better visualize this, but there are limits to how much attention we want to draw to this mechanic of just like we don't want people to have to like to feel like they have to look at this and think about this too much. And so we haven't found a good way of doing a readable but subtle indication of turret heat besides the tower shot sizing, which I personally think is probably not good enough. Maybe it's a little too subtle. Maybe we could do a pumped up version of it. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's the ultimate reason is that this is something that we've looked into improving a number of times, but we've just never come around to the point where we've actually decided to do a bigger project on this. But wouldn't it's not something it's something I wouldn't be surprised if we did something about this at some point in the future. All right, let's talk about Kayn top. So, for those of you who don't know, I have actually played a lot of Kayn top in my day. I really enjoy Kayn top. I'm a big Kayn top fan. So I have actually several different questions about Kayn top in my my Discord currently. And so I'm just going to sort of generally talk about Kayn top here, what I think about it, and what the concerns are. As someone who's played an enormous amount of Kayn top, probably a more than healthy amount of Kayn top, let's say. Part of what makes Kayn top really fun, or just Kayn solo lane in general really fun, is that when you transform, a lot of the things that you get to do to people are kind of unreasonable. And to be clear, all champions do something that's unreasonable, right? Like that's kind of a core part of being a champion is that you have to break some rule, right? You have to do something that's compelling, or you're not really much of a champion, right? But Kayn is sharper in this way, where he's being asked to do a specific thing, hit people, this number of times per game time, and eventually become like get this huge power spike, right? Red Kayn, I think, is more problematic as a laner than Blue Kayn, because there are a lot of matchups that once you transform into Red Kayn, even if you are down thousands of gold, you will checkmate the opponent, right? There's very little they can do to interact with you. When Kayn is a jungler, this isn't really important. It actually just doesn't matter at all, because the fact that you checkmate people isn't relevant because you need to farm your jungle, right? You can't spend all of your time in a lane checkmating someone, right? Whereas checkmating people in a lane is very dangerous, when it can happen, particularly early in the game. And so these are risks, right? I'm not saying any of these things bar Kayn from ever being viable in lane. In fact, we intentionally buffed lane Kayn last year at one point. But they are risks, right? They are things that we are aware of when we do changes to Kayn, in particular if we think they're going to affect lane. Now, at the same time, I do think that Lane Kayn offers a really interesting fantasy that is not really offered elsewhere. And I think in particular, the way that his Q is used in lane is really interesting. And I think it's a much more fun spell in some ways, not in every way, but it's a really, really, really fun spell to use in lane. And it's the combat use cases in lane, I think, are actually more interesting than the combat use cases in jungle, because in jungle, it's basically always, I try to hit both the enemy with both parts of my Q. Whereas in lane, there's a lot more interesting, like, oh, I went to the side to dodge this spell, or I went to the side to like position for my W, or to get near this wall to go into an E it to exit combat, or to go roam mid or whatever, right? Like there's a lot of really interesting context around the way that Q is used in lane for Kayn that I think is super, super, super fun to optimize, super interesting to play around. And I think there's a lot of really big upside for Kayn lane, not even just Kayn top, but even Kayn mid, right? And so I think there's really strong upside here. And I think a lot of the reasons why Daniel Klein, the designer of Kayn, was opposed to doing lane Kayn back, when he first made Kayn, I think a lot of those reasons have either degraded or dissolved over the years. And the concerns that are still remaining, at least for me personally as a game designer, are: is lane Kayn too sharp? Is he too checkmatey in top lane matchups and maybe even in some mid matchups, right? Is this a reasonable laning experience, right? If we make him an actually good laner, the laning pattern of him spamming Q on you, especially in the early levels, it's not great, right? I'm not saying it's meaningfully worse than, like, I don't know, what's a good example of this, like Jax QEing on you at level 3 or whatever, right? Or worse than like Darius, ghosting at you level 1 with W or something like that. But it is, even if it's not clearly worse than everything else in the lane, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should just say like, oh yeah, that means it must be completely chill and we should just make it a part of the game. I think largely we'd be happier if lane Kayn was a little better than it is now. It's like quite bad, as far as I'm aware. Actually, I guess I haven't looked at the data in this current season, so I was looking at it last season and it was quite bad. But assuming that lane Kayn is still quite bad, I think we'd be happy with a version of lane Kayn that's like, as an example, say like 47% top or something. Like I think we'd actually be happy if that were true. And it wasn't anywhere close to that last time I checked. So to summarize my thoughts, like there's a lot of concerns. I personally find lane Kayn to be super, super, super fun and super compelling. And I think the way that he plays is really interesting in lane and different from other champions. But I think there are a lot of valid gameplay concerns around some of the things that he does in some matchups around checkmating people and around the fact that he can accrue value by interacting with people in ways that can feel bad, like similar to like kleptomancy, like old kleptomancy, where it's like, oh, you're playing against Vlad, he took klepto, and every single time you interact, you feel bad because you're essentially just giving him power by even getting close, like by even like getting within his auto attack range. That kind of interaction can feel bad. That having been said, I also really like klepto, so anyway. But yeah, those are the kind of concerns. Those are kind of the thinking points around Kayn top. But in my opinion, we could still make Kayn top a lot better before it starts running into a lot of those problems, because ultimately a lot of those problems just don't manifest in a super real way until Kayn is actually like win rate wise competitive with other top laners, right? And so if Kayn top is clearly a little less powerful than other top laners on average, a lot of those really like poor gameplay experiences don't manifest strongly enough to be problematic, right? And so that's kind of the thing where I think there's a lot of things that have like not spectacular gameplay that could live in the like 45 to 47% range and be totally okay and be experiences people can opt into if they really want to have that experience. And that could be good for the game as long as they're not too powerful, because when they become powerful and they become optimal and people play them just because they're the right thing to pick, that can cause some of those problems to manifest a lot more strongly around like the checkmating and so on and stuff like that. So that's my kind of total sum thoughts on Kayn top. And like I said, I'm a huge fan. All right. Why was the fast version of TP removed? So this is a question around like, the enhanced TP and like faster TP channels and stuff like that. The summary is mostly that we've found that really fast TP channels are mostly powerful in the early game. And they're mostly powerful for disrupting the bot lane laning, like the bot lane laning, or disrupting side lane fights that we might rather play out in a more natural, like uninterrupted fashion, right? As an example, when teleport is really, really fast, we've actually tested even faster version. I was actually looking at this. I was looking at a clip from many years ago of us testing a version of TP that had a 3.5 second channel, which was crazy fast. And it was a clip of me teleporting bot lane and just double killing them, which was, I think, to be expected. Anyway, irrelevant anecdote aside, um, a lot of what we found are like the things that happen when you have a really fast TP are not super desirable. Where you can still do long flanks and participate in team fights with a longer TP channel, in the current game. It does all of the things that top laners actually need the summoner spell to do, without having the other interaction or without having the other consequences around. Yeah, sometimes you're playing like a really interesting 1v1 in the side lane as I don't know, Akali versus Rise or something like that. Or I guess that's not a good example because that matchup is brutal. But I don't know, you're having a really interesting 1v1 Syndra versus Rise in the side lane, and oh, you thought you were winning, but actually the enemy, Aatrox just showed up and killed you. And there wasn't a way like ever interacting in the side lane is wrong because you'll get teleported on. When the teleport channel is longer, it means that going for short interactions and going for fights in side lanes and isolated plays on the map is more possible and more relevant, which we generally support later on in the game. In the early game, the concern is mostly like, is this TP too good at ganking bot lane, and disturbing the 2v2? But the evolved version, I think, it's not that we couldn't have a faster TP channel in the current day late game. I don't think it would actually cause like significant problems, but we found that we prefer putting that power budget elsewhere. Like as an example, hey, do you want a shorter channel or do you want a shorter cooldown? Right, as an example of like where the power budget could go. We think that actually it's probably a better summoner for the game if the cooldown is a little lower later on in the game, than having a shorter channel, because you can still do most of the things that we think are correct for TP to do later on, while having the longer channel without having those consequences on isolated interactions and like being able to punish short interactions that we think could and should play out well, for the aggressors, in those cases, right? It also means that map plays of like trying to force lopsided plays on the map is better in a world with longer TP channels, right? Because you get a longer window of opportunity to actually force those lopsided plays, which enables more comebacks, as an example, right? Like this is one of the mechanisms that you can have to enable comebacks is being able to force lopsided plays. Because one of the things that you can do to make a gold advantage less relevant or irrelevant completely is, well, if you just bring an extra person, it's totally okay if the two, if you bring an extra person to a 2v2, it's okay if your 80 carry or whatever is down 1,000 gold because you've brought an extra person who is carrying 7,000 gold in their inventory, and they'll overwhelm that gold advantage, right? And the more responsive and immediate TP is, the less possible it is to make those kinds of plays. That's the kind of summary of thoughts around that space. All right, Lane Nocturne. So this is another interesting one. I've actually also played a lot of Lane Nocturne, though I will say a lot less than I've played Lane Kayn. This was asking questions around like, oh, could we get mana buffs, or like, this feels, some of this feels bad, some of this feels good, etc., etc. My answer to this is that Lane Nocturne, I think, has in some ways worse and in some ways better gameplay than Lane Kayn, right? When Lane Nocturne eviscerates the wave, I think everyone should be able to grasp, like, yeah, Lane Nocturne just deleting the wave and then not having to worry about his mana because his passive just explodes the wave. That's pretty undesirable, right? Like the gameplay there is obviously very poor, where you could just like tank your opponent a couple hits from your opponent and clear the wave instantly out. The gameplay on that was poor. Could Lane Nocturne have better mana costs? I don't know. I don't know what the current power level of Lane Nocturne is, but I think that the risk of lower mana costs is when Lane Nocturne is really good at spamming, like, is good at clearing waves, which lower mana costs would do, particularly lower mana cost on Q. So I think the place where I'd be more inclined to buff mana costs if I were doing it on Nocturne would be like W or E, as an example. But lower mana cost on Q in particular, I think, is dangerous because the more frequently Nocturne can trivially wave clear, the more dangerous Lane Nocturne is from a gameplay health perspective of, oh, he just ignores his opponent, he clears the wave, and he goes in ult spot lane or mid lane or whatever, right? And just does that on repeat and, is a really non-interactive spam wave clear guy who tempos out the game and doesn't scale that well, right? Because Nocturne is obviously going to be strong in terms of fighting people in the early game, right? He has an AD and an AS steroid, and he has a passive that scales with, scales his attacks and all that, right? And heals and so on and so forth, right? Um, his kit has properties such that he's always going to be good at fighting people, like scrapping people early. And so when he also has really powerful non-interactive wave clear, that causes danger, potential gameplay health risks around. Uh, does this champion or is this champion too deterministic at generating early game leads and dominating the early game? Because it's very hard to counterplay a champion that's good at scrapping, has amazing wave clear, and also has a really, really, really high range ability to guaranteed land on someone, right? Like Nocturne Ultimate, part of why it's an acceptable spell in the jungle is that it's his Nocturne's only way to get to someone, for the most part, right? Besides like flashing or, showing up behind him and spending a bunch of time getting around behind someone or whatever. And so therefore, because of his limited windows of opportunity to access people being based on his ultimate cooldown, that's part of what limits the power of Nocturne in the jungle and like the health risks of that ultimate in the jungle. In lane, because you already have limited windows of opportunity to access people anyway, that's less of a concern. And so a lot of that stuff, a lot of those restrictions kind of degrade. But all of this stuff having been said, I don't actually know how good lane Nocturne is on the current patch. Like if lane Nocturne right now is like 40%, we could definitely buff it, right? This is another one of those examples of something where I don't think we'd want to see lane Nocturne at 50%, but 47, maybe even 48, I think could be reasonable, right? Especially if it's the way that he's powerful is specifically on like he's snowballing through roaming and not he's mega wave clearing, right? And so the thing about mana cost in particular, which is what one of the questions was asking about, that's dangerous to me is that when Nocturne is really, really, really good at wave clearing, what he can do is just go off the map and then just threaten people and doesn't even have to ult, doesn't even have to commit that spell in order to generate pressure and generate priority. And that can be really scary from a gameplay health perspective. Is like champions that can permanently do that, they tend to be dangerous. Not saying they could never be done, but it's tough. It's tough. All right. We're going to do a couple more questions here and then cut this one. Of course, we still got plenty left. Maybe enough for a whole other video, to be honest. All right, let's talk about Horizon Focus. So this was a very long post. I cut out the most relevant part of the question here. Was it reverted because we actually don't want to give mages access to haste unless it comes with health, so they pay a big damage cost, even though they were already giving up Magic Pen when doing so, or just because we wanted Old Horizon back? So this is something where if you want to hear more about this, you can go listen to my, or go to my items video that I have. I talk about this towards the end of the video when I'm talking about the items video from this season where I talk about the changes to various items. I think someone has timestamps of me talking about Horizon Focus. Not 100% sure about that, but I think that's there on the video. Anyway, so I've talked about it there, but I'll talk about it again here. In a more in a more straightforward, like specifically talking about Horizon Focus and less about the changes to the item system in general. I actually spent a lot of time for this season iterating through a bunch of different big AP, big haste items. And what we found lined up a lot with what we saw from Horizon Focus, the big AP, big haste stat stick version of it on lives from 14.19 to 16.1, right? When I reverted it, which was, while in theory, there are champions that say, I like both of those stats. Those are the stats that I want. Of course, I would want that item. The actual reality is that not that many champions actually buy that item, right? If it's tuned comparatively to other items, right? The big AP, big stat stick version of Horizon Focus, the only champion buying it with any level of regularity was Vlad. It was like 50-some% pick rate on Vlad, and the next closest champion was like 14%, I think. Big AP and Big Haste sounds really compelling, and I still think to this day that there's probably a version of that item that works. But the reality is that people just don't buy it, right? Like actually you end up looking at the shop and saying like, oh, that item is tuned. Well, I'm going to buy Shadow Flame instead, or I'm going to buy Leandries instead, or I'm going to buy Lichbane instead. There are all a bunch of items that do those things better. Even Cosmic Drive, I think the movement speed is really nice for some of the champions that are like some of the users, like Syndra as an example, really gets value out of that movement speed on Cosmic Drive. And so while I iterated through a bunch of these different big AP, big haste stat stick items, I failed to find a super compelling passive that we actually believed would be something that would be appealing to those mages that are generally believed to really like a lot of those two stats, right? And to be clear, I still think it could work, number one. And number two, this is the entire design philosophy under which Horizon Focus was changed into those, being the stat stick for those two stats. But the actual reality is that people didn't buy it, even when it was super juiced, very highly gold efficient, very cheap item that would have offered a really powerful spike. It was so rarely purchased by anyone except Vlad, who obviously cares a lot about those two stats. And we're not going to keep an item in the game just because Vlad likes it, right? And so ultimately, the way that I look at this space is that could there be something here? Yes, but I think it actually needs a specific hook that tells the story of why you're going to buy it over something more generic and powerful like a Shadow Flame, or something that gives you movement speed like a Cosmic Drive, or something that gives you some durability like a Leandries, or something that gives you that unique, kit bound effect like a Lichbane or something like that, right? That's my conclusion here, is that the space is very difficult because just those stats alone is not enough. It's not good enough. Those stats alone are not going to beat Shadow Flame, as an example, right? They're not going to beat the other options. And so it needs some kind of unique passive that tells you what you're going to buy it for. And like, we need to give them power in some way that is compelling in that space for these mages, right? We needed something that's really good, right? And a comparison I'll give you is, as an example, take an AD champion, right? Imagine that there's two new AD items, right? Like there's a BF Sword Dirk item and there's a BF Sword Caulfield's Warhammer item. One of them is big AD haste and one of them is big AD lethality. Which one of these do you think Jace is supposed to buy, right? Which one of these is actually better on Jace if they're balanced to be, roughly equal in power? I think a lot of people would say the AD haste item, and the actual reality is that Jace would buy the AD lethality item, right? Jace has bought a lot of haste in the past for a variety of different reasons, but he hasn't actually had super incredibly good access to lethality, right? Like Jace Jungle, as an example, largely buys lethality, right? Like, he doesn't buy that much haste. That's actually a question. There was actually a question on that in one of my previous Q&A sections. But the way that Jace's kit is shaped, it's generally superior for most of these champions that are long range and have spell rotations and like spell combos and stuff like this. It's generally better for them to deal more damage on their combo and have higher impact when they do hit a spell than to have higher frequency. Haste is nice, don't get me wrong, right? I'm not saying it's a bad stat on mages by any means. It's good, right? But when given the option between a actually tuned haste versus damage payoff, damage is almost always going to be like damage per interaction is usually going to be the superior option, right? Especially with the way that we've tuned a number of mages, right? Orianna is a great example of, we've given her ult a million buffs over the years, right? Where we've made her core game, like her core spells, a lesser percentage of her power budget. And so therefore, of course, haste becomes less important because a lot of games, what you're actually looking for is just a big one shot on the back line with your R, right? And so I think this comes down to a number of factors of like the way that we've tuned some mages over the years, the way that we've structured mage itemization, and the way that we give mages guaranteed haste value on their first item no matter what, and so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of different things going on here. But ultimately, my answer to this is that I think an item could exist in this space, but it is a lot harder to make than you would think because just the stats alone are not anywhere close to enough. So that's the conclusion on the previous version of Horizon Focus, which is backed up by a lot of evidence, right? Again, we had a version of that Horizon Focus that was extremely efficient, extremely cheap, and people still didn't buy it. So that's where, even though I still think that item could be real, it's just it's tough. It's very tough. All right. This will be my last question since we're at 59 minutes right now. So this is a question talking about, or this was, I guess it was really more of a statement, to be honest. Talking about Volibear top being nerfed because of Volibear jungle, and like noting that there are not really a lot of levers to buff Volley top. And this is something I'll say, yes. So one thing I will say is that I do think that some of our Volibear balance changes haven't been targeted super well. As an example, the AP ratio nerfs that were done sometime last year, I think they were actually intended to nerf jungle more than top, and they hit top more than jungle. And so if you think about it, a significant amount, it's like you could say like, oh, well, top gets more gold in the early game, so of course the AP ratios and they generally builds more AP on average. So therefore, of course, nerfing the AP ratios will be more top skewed. Um, the idea, of course, was that like, well, you're always using your passive on the camps as Volibear jungle, and so you get more DPS there, right? But that was something where I think it should have been something that we flagged as like it's likely to be top skewed. And so that like even though that wasn't the intent, that was what it ended up being. And so we've definitely targeted some of the Volibear changes not as well as we could or should have. Um, but that having been said, I do agree that we could use more top lane skewed Volibear levers because we've run into this issue a number of times where even when the changes are reasonably targeted, it's very hard to buff Volibear top without buffing Volibear jungle. And so a lot of time what we end up doing is like, oh, well, we're going to buff this baseline thing on Volibear a lot and nerf something that we know is actually more impactful in the jungle. And I think that ultimately when I look at Volibear, I would say that I think that his kit could probably use not I wouldn't say like we're not saying like a mid scope or anything like that, but it's like a reshaping to some of his numbers around to where, hey, um, do we think that all these numbers are correct, right? Like as an example, is his W cooldown the right number, right? Like it's very important to his combat pattern, obviously, right? But his W cooldown being as long as it is, oh, I almost just knocked my water bottle to the ground. Sorry. Well, I guess I don't know why I just apologized. That only really affects me. I guess it would have made a large noise or like a loud noise if I did drop it. But anyway, not relevant. I think we could use better levers, and I think looking at the current pacing of top lane gameplay is like, I think asking the question of like, do we think this is the right number of cooldown? Maybe it is, right? Maybe it should be shorter. Maybe it should be slightly longer. Maybe it should scale over with ranks. Do we think that his Q movement speed not scaling with anything is correct? Should it scale with bonus health, AP, AD? Because I think that actually one of his problems is that, or one of the problems of Volibear, in terms of how powerful he is as a jungler, is that all of his movement speed comes from maxing Q. And so maxing Q allows him to have this really powerful deterministic engage on people that top lane doesn't even get until level 13, and it's not even that useful as a top laner, right? And so, as an example, if we made his Q scale with something and lowered the MS that you get, that would be something that would be top lane skewed in terms of power, right? Like that's like the kind of thing I'm thinking about in terms of, are the numbers and the mechanics, like the like tuning of all the mechanics on Volibear's kit correct? I'm not saying any of these things would be good. I'm just saying I'm asking the questions of how would we introduce more levers, and do we want to skew things? Because yes, we have repeatedly run into issues where one of top and jungle have been off or been tuned in a way that we wanted to tune them differently, and we have struggled a number of different times with getting both into a good spot at the same time. So yeah, I guess my summary of my answer here is I think we could do some good work here that wouldn't really require changing any mechanics necessarily, just like mostly numbers tuning. And we could introduce some new levers that we could pull to help out top versus jungle or vice versa. I think that could be a positive for this champion. Anyway, we're over an hour now, so I'm going to be calling the video here. Still got lots of questions for the next Q&A. We'll see when that is. But yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Hope you have a good day or week or month. Honestly, have a good life. And catch you next time.